You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and this is part 2 of my interview with Wendell Moss about racial trauma. Today, we continue to discuss the importance of naming what has been true of the past so that we might be free from it. We also began to talk about what the path toward healing looks like, including the role of lament in the healing process. Thanks so much for listening. Let's dive back into the interview with Wendell. There was an article in Christianity Today last year, and it reported that only 42% of white Christians believe that the history of slavery continues to impact African Americans today. So less than half of white Christians believe that the history of slavery continues to impact Black folks today. And this is, like, just from a neuroscience perspective, Wendell, this is deeply problematic given what neuroscience has discovered about how trauma affects the brain and the body. So will you just share a little bit, Wendell, about what we know about trauma, how trauma affects the brains and the bodies of people for generations to come? How is it passed on generationally?
Again, to listen to my father, to see my father's face, to hear my grandmother, to hear the stories, and to hear, son, grandson, be careful. Here's what you need to be aware of. Here's the world that you live in. And so even in those stories, I bear their faces. I bear their tears. I bear my father's anger. And it's not I'm just setting you up to hate. No. Man, I am hearing the stories and seeing the bodies. And so, one, the fact that I take in their sorrow and their grief impacts my body. So that will be a way that it's passed on. Even for them to have to prepare me, it enters my body, and rightly so.
What I'm thinking is the work of Rachel Yehuda. If people want to learn more about how trauma is passed down generationally, Rachel Yehuda has done a lot of good work, especially with Holocaust survivors, showing how trauma affects the DNA of subsequent generations, even if that subsequent generation does not personally experience the particular trauma.
How did it come to that as a little Wendell at a young age, re-questioning his own body? Because I grew up in a predominantly Black neighborhood, but when I moved to a mixed neighborhood, it felt different in my body. But that something was being communicated. And so again, and I think we use the term epigenetics, passing down from generation to generation. So again, how would my young body know of what my father speaks? And why would it not take heed to the warning? So stories are passed down. And then we see, where have there been systems that we've never recovered systemically from racism? So it's in our systems. We see attitudes that have been passed down through systems, stereotypes. So there's so many avenues, Adam, in which it's passed down from generation to generation.
Right, which goes back to the importance of naming what's true so that it can be metabolized, grieved, we'll get there in a minute, lamented, and healed.
Yes.
There's a professor at Princeton, a guy named Eddie Glaude, and he points out something that I think is stunning, given that we are a quote-unquote Christian nation. And he says that America is not unique in its sins as a country. His point is that, look, lots of countries enslaved peoples from the African continent. But Professor Glaude goes on to say this: where America may be singular is our refusal to acknowledge our sins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're not unique in our sins as a country. Many other nations and groups enslaved peoples from the African continent, But Professor Glaude adds this: where America may be singular is our refusal to acknowledge our sins. What's it like for you, Wendell, to live in a country that was largely built, the economy, largely built on the backs of your ancestors, and also to live in a country that simultaneously does not acknowledge the sinfulness of that?
Being frankly, it feels infuriating, Adam. It feels infuriating. And because the level of dishonor that this country was built so much of backs of my ancestors. That's not acknowledged. Because as far as this country's history, it was built by the white Christian forefathers. So the lack of acknowledgement. But to get more particular, it feels this is where my hope. This is where I wrestle with hope. Because for you to acknowledge this truth you're talking about opens the door for you to have to admit a lot of things. One, this is not your land. That you did not build this. This was built on others, and it was built on forced labor. And that you were the perpetrators of it. Man, I lose hope that will be acknowledged. And it feels hard. This is part of the risk. That this is part of the sweating that I feel in my body. Because part of me always speaking about it is the hope that people will be more and more truthful. That's the invitation. And to often feel the refusal can just be damn hard when the truth is not acknowledged.
At some level, I understand why folks who don't identify as Christian might be reluctant to confess what's true about the history of racial trauma in this country. But for Christians to be reluctant, I mean, even a cursory reading of the Old Testament will tell you in no uncertain terms that God is immensely interested in honesty about social exploitation. And for the American kind of Christian church to be reluctant to name with honesty and integrity social exploitation, it makes me go, what the hell is going on that we're so afraid of confessing this? Something's going on. And I want to share the words of Cornel West one more time. He simply says, the American government, the mouthpiece of the American people, has not yet even acknowledged the impact of slavery on the present. It has erected no monuments, admitted no memory, made no reparations, accepted no responsibility. And it's not just the government. Most white folks have not acknowledged the impact of slavery on the present. And yet, Wendell, you courageously write the following in your essay. You say, the truth of the matter is that racism is a reality. Racial trauma is a reality. We must honor the fact, these are your words, that we can't experience this kind of collective trauma for centuries and it not reside and linger in all of our bodies. Why do you believe that racial trauma, for slavery, Jim Crow, into the present exploitation of Black bodies, all that racial trauma includes, why do you believe that resides and lingers in our bodies?
We see how this still happens, both implicitly. We relive it. Again, it's in our systems, it's in our bodies, therefore it replays. So, Adam, we're reliving this over and over, from the shootings to the fact that African Americans have often been threatened to be fired from their jobs because of their hairstyle. That would be one of those signs of it continuing to reside in our bodies, because there's been a passing down of what is considered good, human, beautiful, when history says that my body is not beautiful. And so here we have it passed down where that message is still coming through.
And what's so tragic in my mind from a body of Christ perspective is that God seems to absolutely love diversity. I mean, just look at the creation
Yes.
of both humans and the broader creation. God is very interested in diverse representations of humanity. And yet, we are so reluctant to accept and even celebrate the otherness of one another.
Yeah. And I think there's a sense of where in our bodies has other become dangerous. Because history has made it other. If you're not white, then you're dangerous. If we can, back to this whole statement, if we can't tell the truth about what's in our bodies, and that's why we do story work, if we can't tell the truth about what's in our bodies, then we can never heal what's in our bodies. Why is it still residing, really lingering in our bodies still? We're still not honest. And the wound just grows.
And you seem to be saying, Wendell, that racial trauma not only resides in Black bodies,
Yeah.
but in white bodies as well. And this is a primary point that Resmaa Menakem makes in the book My Grandmother's Hands, with great nuance, scholarship, and I think very convincingly. But can you say more about this? What do you mean that racial trauma exists in my white body?
Whites came to this country out of their own trauma, reliving their own trauma, and therefore becoming the perpetrators of trauma. So they came here out of their own trauma.
Yeah.
And that is so rarely named. That's not a piece of history that's really highlighted in the history books.
To get a little bit more particular with it, lots of people in the 14, 15, 1600s are experiencing, white people are experiencing massive levels of powerlessness,
Yes.
violence, and humiliation
Yes.
over in Europe, in England, etc. And they flee. This is what trauma does. They flee that helplessness and that powerlessness and come to this country. And whenever you can know this, whenever you have experienced powerlessness, the greatest temptation is to take power and to use it against someone else.
And to get it back and try to get it back.
Get back on top.
And the problem is, which is what will also it would linger, is that you will never get it back. You will no matter how hard you try, you will continue to try, but you'll never get it back. And what's it like to have to grieve that you'll never get it back?
I'm glad you mentioned that word grief, because we're going to get to grief in a minute. But first, you tell a story in your blog post about something that happened to you at age 12, when your father came home from work one day. Will you share that story again now? We've already talked about taking these things into your body, but this story was really poignant for me.
It's a story that still brings it still brings tears, because I remember my dad's, I remember his face, and he just came home and he was just angry, and apparently he had stopped at a stop sign, but right before that a man had cut him off. And the man eventually pulled up to my father at a stoplight and said, "You damn spook." And when my father came home, when my father was angry, when something was going on, you could tell in his face. And I remember my dad telling the story to my mom, and I'm standing there, and he said, "Yeah," and he called me a spook. To see the anger in my father, because my father was a man who, you don't see him sweat. Not too much he's not gonna let you see how hurt he is. So he wasn't crying, but to see his anger, but to see him for a second look deflated, I will never, ever, ever forget it. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, whoa. And me being called a name was in the proximity of this. So to see my father hit my father like it did was huge. And I just remember it was in my body. I remember feeling kind of, I stood there. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do with my dad.
And so you absorbed into your young body humiliation, powerlessness, an immense sense of, I would imagine, helplessness to help buoy up your dad's deflation.
There's nothing I can do. And while there's nothing I can do, it's also agreeing with the stories that are already in my little black body. I have a smaller brain. I have an extra bone in my leg. Here's more evidence that my dad is bringing home.
One more quote from your essay, Wendell. You say that denial or dismissal are often strategies used to try to escape the impact of our racialized trauma, but the result has only led to reenactment. There's a lot there. Let me say it again. Denial or dismissal are often strategies used to try to escape the impact of our racialized trauma, but the result has only led to reenactment. Now, first of all, can you define reenactment? What do you mean?
Reenactment is our past continue to be with us, and us reliving it over and over and over, and not meaning to, but it's continuing to repeat itself because of a pattern that's in us.
And so, how does denial of racial trauma lead to reenactment?
To continue to deny racial trauma means that I won't stop and take a look and see what's wrong with the systems. I won't stop and look and see what's wrong with me. I won't halt and be curious. And therefore I'll continue to we live in patterns. We live in a way that makes our world work. That's why we hold on to biases. So if we don't stop and pay attention to what's driving us, we'll continue to live in the way that we know until it's disrupted. If we deny our racial trauma, we won't allow ourselves and our patterns to be disrupted.
And if they're not disrupted, and if confession does not occur, there's no way for lament to begin. And this is where I want to go now, because in your post, you not only identify the problem, but you lay out a path forward, a way to move forward as a nation, as a community. And here's what you say.
Mhm.
It feels crucial for us to be willing to finally face our history with integrity and courage. I believe we first must face that we all suffer from our past to this day. If we can own that, you say, I believe we will possibly be able to authentically move towards collective lament and therefore collective healing rather than continue to reenact. So the path that you're proposing is honestly facing our history,
Mhm.
that is acknowledging what actually happened and what continues to happen,
Mhm.
which is a very biblical and kind of prophetic invitation to be clear about what went down.
Mhm.
But then you say the next step is collective lament. Now, what in the world is that? And why is it such an important part of the process of healing?
If families, because I believe trauma, if we talk about individual to families, to neighborhoods, to cities, I believe that as we begin to hopefully do some of this work personally, and then how do we begin to how do we impact our families? How do we then impact the people around us? How do we then impact systems? And where we have a sense of, man, my lament, I've invited my family to it. I've invited my friends to it. They've invited other people to it. I invited my coworkers too. So it's almost like collective lament seems to be this expansive thing that's possible.
And it can join us
Yes.
together.
Yes.
Lament can join us when it is shared. And what do you mean by lament? What does it look like, Wendell, to lament the history of racial violence in our past?
There is a sitting in and owning of what's true, and feeling the grief, feeling the powerlessness,
Mm-hmm.
and being together in it, and feeling the pain from where we have come from, and being able to experience godly sorrow in that lament. I love what you just said, and I don't want to let it go. And you said bringing us together, like bringing us together. This feels like a totally different together that I often hear about. Like the term unity, when I hear that term immediately, it drives me nuts. Because I often feel like, here's another. This is in the name of denial. This is the name of, can we just forget and not bring it back up? So there's this unity that's often there, which is often a move away from lament and the grief, the kind of collective healing that you kind of move towards. Like we get to heal together, but this coming together is much more. It's much more difficult. It actually feels painful.
Yes. And complex and messy
Yes, sir.
and deeply uncomfortable.
Yes, sir. And what would it be like for us to sit with each other in that? Because now we're sitting in truth.
It reminds me of another book, another mentor of mine from afar, Michael Eric Dyson. He wrote a book that really influenced me somewhat recently, and it's called Tears We Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America. And in this book, Dyson, he asks something of those of us who are white. And this is what he asks. He says, "What I ask you to do, my dear friends," and this man is so winsome. He's so winsome. I ask you to do what I ask you to do, my dear friends, is to try the best you can to surrender your innocence, to reject the willful denial of history, and to live fully in our complicated present with all of the discomfort it brings. Now, as you, Wendell, have engaged the subject of racial trauma with white people, I imagine you've had mixed experiences, some bad, some not so bad. What's it like for you when a white person begins to surrender some innocence and acknowledge, even a little bit, the history of the American assault on Black humanity?
I can't be more frank than to say in those moments, I breathe a little. Let's be real clear about that. I breathe for a second. And whether the hope stays for a minute or even for a second, I breathe for a second. There's a relief. That's what flows through my body. I breathe.
It is not altogether a different kind of breathing than when my father confesses some of the ways that he has harmed me, which happened to me in 2009. And I was able to breathe a little more.
I love your example. And if you can imagine that on a collective level, I mean, that elicits so much in me. The vision of Dyson's words is like, it's also okay. I'm glad the attempt is not to make me feel crazy once again. As a black man, I'm making this up like I don't have anything else to do.
Wendell, we've covered a lot of ground, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you want our listeners to know about this topic. I mean, I know there's plenty you want our listeners to know, but given this context, anything rumbling around inside that you want to put words to?
I just want to go back to what we were saying from the very beginning. And the reason I even wrote this blog, and that is this racial trauma is we. This is not just African Americans, Latino, Indigenous, Asian. This is we, as in white folks included. If there's an understanding that we've been impacted by something, then we'll investigate. But if we don't think something impacts us, we'll move away. So I think just to say racial trauma, you haven't avoided it. And therefore, will you be curious about it? How you go about that? It will be different. It will be different journey for different people. But will you stop and be curious about what does racial trauma look like in your body? Whether you think you perpetrated it or not, will you be curious? That is that is the invitation.
It makes me think of a quote from, I believe her name was Lila Watson. She's an Australian Aboriginal woman who said, "If you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you believe that your liberation is bound up with ours, then let us work together." And white folks, we have to realize that our freedom and our liberation is bound up with the liberation of the oppressed and the exploited.
And that is exactly what I'm hoping my white brothers and sisters will hear. You are bound as well in racial trauma. And so therefore, as you enter this conversation, may this impact your entry posture and how you enter. Can you enter with the possibility, again, of us? Because us, them, those are way two different entry postures. If it's them, then you come arrogant, non-curious. But if it's us, then there's a sense of, if I can be frank, like, what the hell is going on? What the hell is going on with us?
Wendell, I can't thank you enough for your words today, your presence, your risking, your sharing, especially the personal anecdotes, the personal stories just from your own life. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome, madam. Thank you for this platform, and thank you for taking the risk yourself to do this. Because I know I've been at this long enough, so that anyone who goes here, especially during these times, this political atmosphere, you're risking. So I appreciate you taking the risk to go here, Adam. Thank you.